Yeah. You good? Working? Oh, hey. Is the audio working? Is there any way to know? Probably there's not. The audio is working? Okay, cool. Wow, that was easy.
Buddy Jesus. Was that what you were doing?
No, I'm just being myself. Really?
Do you know who Buddy Christ is?
Yeah. Yeah, that's hilarious. Man, I don't have that in there, but there's other stuff in here.
He has a Buddy Christ Christmas.
Oh, really?
For my ugly Christmas sweater.
Sometime.
I was going to ask if you were recording, but you are.
I am recording.
Great, awesome.
Yeah. I had you in mind.
Okay, good. I've already gotten questions. Is it being recorded?
Yeah.
I gotta run. God bless.
Thanks so much.
I love to be able to do
Alrighty, guys. It is the 45, and if I don't start now, I'll have to wait for another 15 minutes. So, why don't we get started? Let me first pray for our time together, and then we will get started. Father God, thank you for this day. Thank you for this time that we have together. I ask that you would bless it. You would help our time to expose some of the bad thinking that we have. Would it encourage us to think more carefully about our faith? And would it help us to foster a better unity between your world and your word? We love you. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Okay, so welcome to the Science and Faith Talk. I am Luke Batty. I will continually look away from the mic so you guys can't hear me. So I'm going to try not to do that. I'm going to remember what I put together. I put this together, so I should know it. I'm Luke Batty. I am a scientist. I have a PhD in experimental pathology from Yale. I have a bachelor's and master's degree in biochemistry and assorted associate's degrees. And I'm a professional scientist, but I'm also a member here at Trinity. And so this is a topic that is very visceral for me, and I'm hoping that some of the things I can talk about today can help you think about how science and faith interact a little better. First, let me tell you about what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to start with a little introduction about, I'm just making sure it is what I thought it was. All right. A little introduction about maybe a story about the relationship between science and faith that maybe you've heard or maybe you've thought or that's just sort of in the air. And then we're going to move on to the first part, which is going to talk about philosophy, unfortunately. And then we're going to move on to defining some important terms. And then we're going to sort of apply what we talked about in our third part to the science and faith discussion. And I'll end with a few important questions about how we can approach science and faith questions. But before we get into there, let me talk about what my goal for the class is. My goal is to talk about the apparent conflict between Christianity and science that many of us have experienced. This has been going on since before we were alive. And my goal is hopefully to expose that it doesn't actually have to be this way. That all these conflicts between science and faith, these apparent conflicts are primarily philosophical in nature, and there's actually no good reason for these two areas of life to be at odds. There's a legitimate tension between these two, but they should be partners, okay? So notice that they are straining against each other, right? But they're together in unity. That's what I want. Biceps. Okay. So let me start with a little fable, a little story. The earliest theoretical attempts to describe and explain the universe involved the idea that events and natural phenomena were controlled by spirits with human emotions who acted in a very human-like and unpredictable manner. These spirits inhabited natural objects like rivers and mountains, including celestial bodies like the sun and the moon. They had to be placated and their favors sought in order to ensure the fertility of the soil and the rotation of the seasons. Gradually, however, it must have been noticed that there were certain regularities. The sun always rose in the east and set in the west, whether or not sacrifice had been made to the sun god. Further, the sun, the moon, and the planets followed precise paths across the sky that could be predicted in advance with considerable accuracy. The sun and the moon might still be gods, but they were gods who obeyed strict laws, apparently without any exceptions, if one discounts stories like that of the sun stopping for Joshua. Eventually, there was only one God left, and with the advent of reason and science, there was no longer any need to have any gods at all. Science had proven where we had come from, what we are, and dispelled all fantasies, paving the way for the enlightened rule of evidence and logic. Maybe this sounds familiar to you. Maybe this is something that you have imbibed in our culture, the idea that once there was this thing that we called faith that we used to understand the world, but over time, with greater science and greater knowledge, faith was pushed to the margins, and eventually there was no need for it at all anymore because we had all the information that we needed. Well, how can we evaluate a story like this, right? Despite how entrancing it is, this ode to science over faith is actually not science, but philosophy. And so it's necessary for us to actually use philosophical categories to evaluate it. And I titled this, Oh No Philosophy, because everybody is scared of philosophy and philosophers for good reason. What is philosophy? Isn't philosophy just fruitless speculation and endless unsolvable questions instead of dealing with solid facts? Or maybe you're thinking of what the Bible prohibits, the use of philosophy in 1 Corinthians 1:21 about vain philosophies of men. I think we have to be careful here because I think in both cases, our problems aren't with philosophy, they're with philosophers, okay? And for good reason, philosophers often talk about inane and abstruse things in very complicated ways that make our heads hurt, and we're like, oh, please, I don't want to deal with this stuff. But really, philosophy is something that you can't get away from. Philosophy, strictly speaking, is about clear thinking. Something that we all need to use philosophy. We all need to decide whether an argument is worth accepting, right? And so this is what philosophy is. This is actually tools for understanding when it is appropriate to believe something or to accept an argument, okay? I think G.K. Chesterton put it best when he said, men have always one of two things, either a complete and conscious philosophy or the unconscious acceptance of the broken bits of some incomplete and often discredited philosophy. Philosophy is merely thought that has been thought out. It is often a great bore, but man has no alternative except between being influenced by thought that has been thought out and being influenced by thought that has not been thought out. And so we have to decide, are we going to actually take advantage of the tools of clear thinking to look at this problem of science and faith, or are we just going to sort of take whatever we get from the ether and assume that it all kind of makes sense? I'm going to tell you that we can't just take what we have from the ether. We actually have to take advantage of the tools of clear thinking. So let me talk about some of these tools. Now this is going to be the most boring slide that I have. But it's an important slide. As is often the case with boring things can often be very important. So let me talk about the parts of a good argument, the parts of an argument in general, and then we can talk about what they mean. So first, we have the data. And when we talk about data, we're just talking about the raw information that we have, and we're hoping that it's more or less complete. This could be just observations from nature. This could be evidence from a text. This is just the information that we have in front of us. And the completeness is an important point, right? Because physicists like to say that they can say something generally about atoms, etc. But we know, at least we hope we know, that they haven't looked at all the atoms in the universe, ostensibly. And so there has to be a point at which we say, okay, this is enough information for us to say something about it, right? So data, we hope, is complete enough for us to say something, and they can be incomplete, as we'll talk about. Another part of an argument are the premises. And these are just our assumptions. These are our assumptions of a truth prior to us making the argument, right? It would be really, really annoying to start every argument with, I think, therefore I am, and then they move forward with every single thing. We have to assume some stuff before we move forward with our argument. Otherwise, thinking is basically impossible. And we have to be careful because there are some things, what we might call touchstone truths or axioms. These are premises that we have to hold to even start thinking, right? So premises like, I can trust my faculty of reason to make conclusions, okay? There are other minds instead of my own that are out there that I can communicate with, right? These are things that we have to assume to even start thinking at all. And if we start to argue about axioms, this is the philosophers that you don't like, okay? These are the people who say, I'm going to try to argue that for this or that axiom, but the problem is they have to have their own axiom, and it's an endless cycle that never ends, right? And this is why we can call them touchstone truths, because to even talk about anything, we have to be touching these premises, like the world exists, my eyes are seeing real things, etc., right? But these other premises that aren't axioms, these are questionable, right? These should be open to debate. And it's actually an important thing to debate them because sometimes most of the time, they're hidden. So if I say something like, you either believe in the Big Bang or divine creation, there's a hidden premise there. And the hidden premise is the Big Bang and divine creation are mutually exclusive. They cannot be both true at the same time, right? But I didn't state that in my argument. I was making a claim, and I was assuming that they were mutually exclusive. You see how that can work? And so we have to be careful of these premises. And so a lot of what we should be doing in clear thinking is exposing premises and evaluating whether they're good premises or not. Okay, moving on. I told you this was going to be boring. Okay, moving on, we have the terms. Now this is the most boring of all. The terms are literally just defining words, okay? But this is so crucial, because if I make an argument and I define and I'm defining the word one way, you may be hearing a totally different argument because you're defining the words in a totally different way. And so I'm saying X and Y, and you're hearing Z and, I don't know, another letter. I started too late in the alphabet. Okay, so defining words. We're going to be doing that next, and then in the next part. Bear with me, it's going to be important. Next, the logic. What is logic? Well, for our purposes, I'm defining logic as our process of arranging information in a way to make a conclusion, right? To make an inference. So it's our method of arranging things such that we can make any kind of conclusion. And there's different ways of arranging these information, this raw information, these arguments, to make a valid conclusion, right? One way that we arrange stuff is using deductive inferences. Deductive inferences are they're basically true if the premises are true, and this is often what we're doing when we're talking about mathematics, okay? If there's 1 and you add 1, you get 2. The inference is a deductive inference. It is true, right? So a lot of mathematical equations are deductive inferences, okay? Most of what we're doing are not deductive inferences, but we use all of these different tools that I'm talking about in everyday life, right? So if I enter a room and I see that it's empty and I can't find the person I'm looking for, I can assume that they're not in this room, right? That's a deductive inference because I'm assuming if they're not in this room, then they can't be in this room, therefore they're not in this room. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, moving forward. Inductive inferences. Now, these are more, are different. These are generalizations from observations, okay? We're observing a bunch of different things and we're saying, I'm gonna make a generalization about this from what I've seen. So let's say, for instance, I go out on the street and I see cars and I wanna know how many wheels cars have, and I just count the wheels of cars and I say, okay, they got 4 wheels there, 4 wheels there, 4 wheels there, 4 wheels there, okay. All right, all cars have 4 wheels, right? Now you and I know that that's actually not true, that there are other cars, there are these weird cars that have like 3 wheels. And then you have these 18-wheelers, right, which have 18 wheels. So sometimes it depends on the breadth of the data. Remember I said data and how complete it is? It depends on how much information we have that gives us a confidence to say how well the argument in inductive inference is working. We have another kind of inference, abductive inferences. So abductive, or you could call them historical inferences. These are conclusions based, the logic is coming to a historical event, looking at the evidence around it, and determining out of all the possible explanations of what this event is, which one is the most likely. This is an abductive inference. This is what detectives use. They go into a crime scene, they say, oh, there's a crime. And then they look around and they say, okay, what could have happened here to explain this crime? And this is what we use often in the sciences. A geologist goes out and sees a geological formation. He says, I see this geological formation. Based on what I know, what evidence, what are the possible ways that this geological formation could have formed? It's a unique historical event, and we're trying to explain it based on different evidence. Okay, we have another part, the scope. And the scope is with respect to what? And you should always ask this question whenever somebody says anything, with respect to what, right? And so back to my car example, if I'm going out and I'm counting the wheels on a car and I say all cars have 4 wheels, it would be, even with that bad argument, it would be wrong to say, I'm saying that everything that has an engine has 4 wheels, right? Because the scope of my argument was specifically cars, right? I can't say, therefore, airplanes have 4 wheels. I don't actually know how many wheels an airplane has. It has more than 4, right? Yes? Depends on the plane. Okay, see, well, I really don't know. Anyways, it wouldn't be right to base it on what my observations were. And then the next part of the argument, our last part, is our gradation of confidence. How sure am I based on the argument, all the different elements of what we've seen so far, the data, how complete is the data, the premises, the terms, the logic, and the scope. How sure am I of the conclusion that I've drawn? Back to my car example, I've counted all these different cars. I see there's 4 wheels, but I'm like, well, I haven't counted that many cars really in the grand scheme of things. So maybe I should say most cars have 4 wheels, right? I'm lowering my level of confidence in my conclusion, my inductive inference, based on the completeness of my data. Does that make sense? And so these tools, if we really apply these tools to the science and faith debate, you're gonna find that many of the conflicts that we see are actually philosophical disagreements, right? Hidden premises that are conflicting. Maybe incomplete data. Maybe we have a problem in the logic. Maybe the terms are meaning different things, right? So this is an important part of what we need to have in our toolkit if we're going to address the science and faith debate. Okay, we're done with this. Moving on. let's start defining some terms. Okay, first term to define is science. What do we mean by science? You're thinking in your minds about something right now. And I know what it is. Because once I shave my head, I can now read minds. So, we have a popular definition of science. And I'm thinking it's something in your mind is maybe something like this. Science is the collecting of data from observations of the world, the organizing of these observations into generalizations we call laws that ideally will be represented mathematically. And then this results in objective knowledge that is free of bias, right? That's what this guy does, you know? This is kind of what I look like on a daily basis, you know? Except he looks a lot happier than I do most of the time. You know, but look what he's doing. He's looking in the microscope. He's gathering observation. He's writing them down. I'm sure he's writing down a generalization into a law right now. Usually when I have that face, it means I just realized I forgot a control, and now I have to redo the experiment. So anyways. However, are there some problems with this definition? There are a few, and I'm going to point out three. The first of this is this question of free of bias. I'm going to go backwards through the definition. Free of bias. Now, of course, we are all very concerned about bias for a good reason. A very famous scientist once said, "It is a capital mistake to theorize before you have all of the evidence. It biases the judgment." Okay, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about we don't want bias, right? We don't want things other than the evidence to interfere with our conclusions. However, there is a good kind of bias, right? A good kind of bias, you say? Yes. The other good kind of bias, the same scientist points it out. It's actually, he says, it is of the highest importance in the art of deduction to be able to recognize out of a number of facts which are incidental and which are vital. Okay? What do I mean? When I go into a room and I'm looking for a person and the person's not in the room, I think a generally good bias is to say they're probably not invisible, right? Now, that's a bias. Could they be invisible? Probably not. But did I take out my yardstick and wave it around the room to make sure I didn't hit somebody, right? No. We're hoping actually that people come to questions with a little bit of bias, right? The exclusion of irrelevant information and the focusing on relevant information, right? And we know that this can cause problems, but the other issue is that every human being brings bias, right? And so there's no way for us to get around it. So the question is, how do we minimize the negative bias and encourage the positive kind of bias, right? Clear thinking. Another problem with the bias issue is that science is a power word. So when a scientist says, well, the science says, or I'm a scientist, and in my studies, I see X, Y, and Z, you can see that this is actually an argument from authority, right? And so there is a bias, oftentimes, for a certain conclusion so that one person can say, well, my conclusions have shown this, and that makes me very special, right? This is actually not a logical argument, it's an ethical argument. And I'm not saying ethical in the sense of like a moral argument. I'm saying it's ethical in the sense of it's an argument from reputation, from authority, right? And so we have to be careful. There's negative bias in science, and it's oftentimes to promote a certain level of status. So let's be careful about this whole free of bias thing. It doesn't exist. Okay, another thing that we need to be careful about is studying these generalizations, right? Generalizing everything's into a law. And it's true. Oh, sorry, I should have mentioned. Those quotes came from Sherlock Holmes. So, and he should know, right? He's one of the best scientists ever. Okay. So, another important problem with this is this idea of generalizing things into law. Like, this is what science is. And while scientists do study regularities in nature all the time, like the laws of motion, cellular signaling, chemical reactions, etc., scientists also study unique historical events, right? Let me ask you a question. Is this guy a scientist? Yes. If you don't know who it is, it's Charles Darwin. Okay. Yes, this guy's a scientist, but he didn't go into a lab and make observations about regularities. He went out into the field, he made observations about different kinds of animals, and he made an abductive inference about a historical event that happened in the past and what he thought was the likely explanation of that, right? So we need to be able, in our definition of science, to include the study of those unique events, those historical events, right? And so when we say science, we can't just mean only the generalizations, right? And indeed, if we go even farther back in our definition, like I mentioned, Charles Darwin wasn't sitting in a lab doing experiments. It's important in our definition of science that we have the idea of empiricism, right? This is what we mean, like looking for information in the world, but again, we can't restrict that just to experiments, right? If it's, there's publicly accessible information out there, and I think people like geologists, cosmologists, zoologists, these are actual scientists, even though they oftentimes aren't sitting in a lab, changing variables like I do on a daily basis. So we need to be able to include information that's not just from experiments, right? We want to include a greater breadth of information in what we're calling science, because the scientific method, scientists don't only do experiments, right? Despite the fact that most of the time, that is a really important tool that we have for studying regularities. So, can we have a better definition? Can we have a better definition that really covers more of what we actually mean by science and what scientists actually do? Okay? So let's think about where we get the word science. Science actually comes from the medieval Latin word scientia, or scientia. I don't speak Latin, so I don't know how to pronounce it. But this word in the medieval period was describing an area of disciplined and rational study, right? Something that was systematic and logical and contained. And this was in the tradition of Aristotle. And so when we think about this highlights another element to a better definition of science. I was going to say gooder. A better definition of science that includes another element. So let's think about these three things I think we should add. Discursive reasoning. That was what I was just talking about. Scientia, a rational, disciplined study. Discursive reasoning just is talking about writing down your argument in a reasonable way, in a systematic way, and you're opening it up for criticism, right? And this is often what scientists are doing. Another element we talked about earlier was empiricism. Actually going out and looking at publicly available information, observing publicly available data, right? And this could be nature, it could be an ancient inscription on some stone wall. This is what we mean when we're talking about empiricism. We're looking at what is around us. And then finally, distantiation. It's a real word. I double-checked. Distantiation really just means what we want to say about being free of bias. Distantiation means separating ourselves emotionally from our study, right? We're trying to remove our emotions from the study to not hamper it with bad evidence. So like Sherlock Holmes said earlier, right? We don't want to bias our judgment. Again, there's good bias, and we want to have that, but we don't want our emotional state to be affecting our conclusions. Does that make sense? Okay, that's what we mean by distantiation. So, let's think about a better definition. So, this better definition I'm saying is a science is a discipline in which one studies features of the world around us and tries to describe his observations systematically and critically. Right? And there's lots of benefits of this definition, right? And one of the most important parts is the very first word. Do you see it? We had our tools of good thinking. It is the word a. A science. A science? Yes. So that's the important thing about this definition. A science is a discipline, right? There are a variety of different sciences. I think C.S. Lewis said it best. He said, strictly speaking, there is, I confess, no such thing as modern science. There are only particular sciences, all on a stage of rapid change and sometimes inconsistent with one another. And if you're a scientist in this room, you know this is true, right? We often are in our own discipline with its own rules and its own tradition and history and theories, and we're applying new ideas, new knowledge to expand this thing that is really separate from a different discipline that's looking at different things. And oftentimes, different schools of science are arguing with each other and they're disagreeing, right? And so when we think about science as a discipline of rational study, we can add the fact that there isn't one big thing called science. There isn't the science, right? This helps us with this problem that John Gribben brings up. He says, both evolution and the Big Bang and all the rest are based on the same principles, and you can't pick and choose which bits of the scientific story you're going to accept, right? But with our new definition, we can see the problem with this. There isn't one singular scientific story. There isn't the science that tells us everything and everything. You can't quibble with any of the bits because it's all complete in one thing. And that's not true. Scientists are constantly quibbling over the little bits on all the edges, on here and here. Everybody is trying to flip the scientific story on its head all the time. Different disciplines, right? There is no the science. There isn't any science says. There are only particular sciences and scientists in that discipline who make claims. And when they're making claims, we're going to put on our philosophy hat and say, is that claim well-founded? Does that make sense? Right? Okay. Faith. Another important term for us to understand. What do we mean by faith? Well, here's some common definitions that you may have heard. Faith is unquestioning belief that does not require proof or evidence. Or unquestioning belief in God, religious tenets, etc. Or maybe you're thinking that faith is a belief that implies complete, unquestioning acceptance of something, even in the absence of proof, and especially of something that's not supported by reason. Right? Now, if this is your definition of faith, we have some problems. Okay? First, it's very obvious that these definitions of faith would be obviously conflicting with either of our different definitions of science, right? Because faith is about rejecting reason and ignoring it, and science is about discursive reasoning, empiricism, and evidence, and bringing it in. And so you see how, if this is your definition of faith, there's obviously a conflict between science and faith, right? But any Christian in the audience is already thinking, you keep using that word, I don't think it means what you think it means, okay? Inigo Montoya got it right, all right? Faith is not what these are saying. So is there a better definition of faith, right, that doesn't move it to the fringes of irrationality? So what are some biblical definitions? A better biblical definition, there's actually two that I want to point out. And one of them is a verb. And I think the best way to understand this definition of faith is faith as trust, right? So where are we getting this? So faith as trust, if we look at this passage in John, if I'm not doing, this is Jesus speaking, if I am not doing the works of my Father, do not have faith in me. But if I'm doing them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, so that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. Right? Is this Jesus saying, hey, if you don't believe I'm doing the works of the Father, even better. Now you should have even more faith in me, right? Because you have even less evidence of what I'm doing. No, he says, even if you don't believe that I'm from the Father, look at what I'm doing. And if I'm doing the works of God, then now you know what I am saying is true of me. Does that make sense? It's faith as trust. Here's another example. At the end of the Gospel of John, and I'm just taking from John because these are great quotes, but it's all throughout the Bible. Now, Jesus did other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So faith in this telling, faith as trust, is taking the evidence that we have and putting trust in a person. It's rational trust of a person. We're saying, I have good evidence to believe that I can trust this person, right? This is what the Bible is talking about when it talks about faith. To put your faith in Jesus Christ, right? Why? Because you've seen what he's done, right? You can see what he's done in the world, and you can believe that he is who he said he was, right? This is a far cry from our unquestioning belief. And, another way that we can understand this, if we look at the famous Hebrews passage, Hebrews 11:1, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. You can see how our faith as trust factors here, right? Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, right? It's not just merely I assent to what I've seen. It's I assent to what I've seen, and now this gives me confidence of a further truth, right? The conviction of things not seen, right? Many of us have not seen Jesus. I will wager, okay? But we can still believe in Jesus. We can have faith in Jesus despite the fact we haven't seen him based on the evidence that we have. Does that make sense? That's the first definition of faith, and I think C.S. Lewis put it very well, as he puts so many things. Faith, in the sense in which I'm using the word here, is the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted in spite of your changing moods. For moods will change whatever view reason takes, right? So we accept something. We put our faith and our trust in a person, and then we hold on to that faith even though our feelings may be changing back and forth. Remember that distantiation we talked about? It's an important thing, both in faith. Okay, what about another definition? Another understanding of the word faith is the faith. This is a noun, right? And when we talk about the faith, we're talking about something that Paul is talking about in 2 Timothy here. It says, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith, right? And so when we're talking about the faith, this is the content of the scriptures, what we could call the theological worldview of Christianity, right? And so when we're talking about science and faith conflicting, we're talking about science and the faith conflicting, right? Because the faith includes our claims about redemptive history, the truth claims of God's being and other essentials. It includes the secondary issues of Christianity, like ecclesiology and the ordinances. And therefore the faith has a lot of content that is open to interpretation or further justification, right? We're arguing about this. And even though Reformed Congregationalist Baptists have everything right and all the other Christians have everything wrong, we can still have patience with them because these are things that are up for debate, right? So as a source of knowledge, Scripture itself has to be accessed using our tools of good thinking, right? And this is very true. That maybe you recoil at that, but you have to think, there are many people throughout the centuries who have read the Bible and come away with the completely wrong idea. And they're still around. We call them Jehovah's Witnesses. We call them Mormons, right? These are people who have taken the Bible and have taken wrong ideas from them because they were not applying good, careful thinking to the text. Okay? So even the Bible is something that we have to apply our principles of good thinking to. Okay? Okay. So, we have a definition of science. We have a definition of faith. Now, what do we do with these? Part 3. Oh, yeah, and if you use the wrong definitions of faith, Aquinas will give you the stink eye. Okay? So be careful. You don't want this. Okay. Let me give you a more accurate history of the history of science and faith. Believe it or not, the scientific method actually arises from the medieval Christian universities. And it's called natural theology or natural philosophy. And the idea here is that God has intelligibly created the universe and that we, as people made in his image, can understand what God has done in nature and glorify him for it, right? And so in this sense, our faith is actually an impetus to do science because we want to actually look at the way and what God has done in the world, right? As a source of praising him. And I think Johannes Kepler said it right when he said, the scientist can think God's thoughts after him. And so it's an act of meditative praise to God. And we can bring back maybe the first scientist, first empiricist in this tradition, to Roger Bacon. He was very famous in the medieval period, actually all the way back in the 1200s, using using empiricism to observe nature and make predictions and study the regularities. In fact, he was so good at this that some people thought he was a wizard, and there was this huge legend that he created this brazen head, that he had captured a demon and like put it in the brazen head and it would tell him truths about the universe, right? And whether or not that's true, he was a very good scientist. Some say that he was the first scientist. Others say that it's actually his mentor, Robert Grosseteste, who was maybe the first scientist. Although Grosseteste means fathead, so really, can we really trust anything this guy says? So, anyways, moving forward, this process of empirically looking at the world, writing it down, writing down your observations, critically looking at it, continues on over and over until it becomes formalized, systematized, institutionalized in the 1600s by men like Robert Boyle. If you guys have done any chemistry, you remember Boyle's law of the ideal gas? I love that stuff. I love the ideal gas law. Makes everything make sense, even though there aren't any ideal gases. But we can imagine and we can love it, you know. We also have the famous Isaac Newton, which just goes to show that back when Christians were doing science, people had just fabulous hair, and this helped them understand the world better. Is in my opinion. I don't know. I'm definitely jealous. So throughout this period, the scientific method continues to be systematized, and it continues to be broadly used. And it's actually at this time that science commits itself to something called methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism is the assertion that we're going to approach these ideas of the regularities of nature with the assumption as if there's only a natural process going on, and that'll help us understand, figure out what things are relevant to the discussion. And this actually becomes very helpful. And throughout this period, you have great successes in mathematics, astronomy, physics, chemistry, and it continues on for the next century or so, right? Now, there's a turn. In the 19th century, we have new evidence coming out. We have new evidence from a variety of different sources. This is at the time that science is being institutionalized in the United States. There's advances in geology, paleontology, and biology. So for instance, in geology, they were moving away from catastrophism and towards uniformitarianism, right? The implication of which was that the Earth was very old. In paleontology, you have the unearthing of these vast creatures that are extinct, right? But this casts doubts on the permanence of the current biological makeup of the Earth. We also have, obviously, the findings of Darwin, and I always add Alfred Russel Wallace here because he co-discovered it, discovering the mechanism of adaptation and natural selection, which posited that there's a possibility of a continuum of animal forms, right? And so now you can see how some of these new ideas, these new conclusions that are coming out in science are starting to creep on our idea, our conception of what the Bible is teaching about history, right? And so we're starting to see that tension. However, this isn't fatal, and many Christians are able to weather these changing ideas and these changing facts very well. However, there's another turn. So now, as the scientific method, as these new sciences are being institutionalized, we actually have the seeds of a new comprehensive secular worldview, what I can call scientific materialism, right? And this worldview is actually an amalgamation of three different assertions, philosophical assertions. One is materialism, right? I mentioned methodological naturalism, the assumption that the world, we can study the regularities in nature as if there's only natural properties going on. Well, this moves into philosophical naturalism or materialism, which is the belief that there really isn't anything other than the physical world that exists, right? And you can see how that is very obviously something that is not compatible with Christianity or any kind of theism, really. And it's not really, in my opinion, compatible with good thinking. Let me tell you why. One, materialism assumes that there's nothing physical in the world. I mean, there's only physical things in the world, which means our brains are only physical, our minds are only physical, and really our ideas, our thoughts are only the firing of chemical reactions, atoms bouncing off each other. So the question is, if that's true, if our ideas, our thoughts are really just the emanations like gas escaping from a soda can, do I have to believe anything that anybody says about anything? Doesn't that undermine all of our systems of good thinking, of rationality itself? Many people who took this view actually did undermine a lot of those axioms we talked about before, those touchstone truths, such as that we can trust our mind to be able to get to relevant conclusions, right? That's undermined by materialism. One of the other facets of this new worldview is reductionism. And again, there's a methodological reductionism that we find in science, which is basically, reductionism is the attempt to understand things as merely a combination of their parts. And so you can understand, this is very helpful in science. We look at this thing, what's going on, we look at the different parts moving around, and we say we can understand how things are going on. But you can see that philosophical reductionism, the idea that things are only just the sum of their parts, brings us to a lot of absurdities, right? Which you can hear this often when people say, people are just bags of chemicals, right? We're all just atoms floating around and moving around and whatever. And this completely misses the idea that there actually are real distinctions between different entities, right? I may be made up of atoms, this podium may be made out of atoms, but we are different things. We're different kinds of things. And even though we have maybe similar chemical properties going on, I really don't move around. I basically move around as much as this podium most of the time, right? We're actually different in kind, right? And so we can't just reduce everything to what it's made out of, because that misses the bigger picture, right? That levels all of the differences that we can observe obviously around us, right? That things aren't just atoms. There are actual different things, living things, not alive things, right? That are different. The third philosophical premise that is brought into this new secular worldview that I'm calling scientific materialism is the idea of scientism. And this is simply the idea that science is the only way we can get true knowledge, right? And I'm sure you've heard this, or you have experienced this idea that, they didn't do an experiment, did they? So how can we really know what that's true or not, right? Scientism, interestingly, is self-refuting. I don't know if you can see this. So if you say science is the only way to get true knowledge, that statement is not scientifically very viable, and therefore that statement is not true, therefore the idea commits suicide, right? It's called a self-refuting idea. Now, granted, there are softer versions of all these. There's soft scientism, which says maybe science isn't the only way for knowledge, but it's basically the only real way for knowledge. It's just like we have to assume that there's other things, otherwise our idea self-destructs. So there's softer versions of this, but these three ideas twine together to form a new sort of secular worldview that becomes institutionalized in the United States at the same time that you're having these upheavals in geology and paleontology and biology. And so they all become an amalgam, and this amalgam is what drives our idea of science, this one big thing called science, right? That has a worldview, that has a history, that has a view about who you are and how the world was made, etc. That thing that we're talking about is actually this worldview, this philosophical worldview. And so But this philosophical worldview is very popular. Why? Because the scientific method is incredibly, incredibly effective. And so they can say, well, science just made your iPhone. Therefore, you can trust what we're saying. We have credibility based on the successes of the scientific method. You see how those two things can be conflated. Okay. Now, these ideas are put forward by people like David Hume or Hegel. There's a whole bunch of different people. Basically, they don't have nice hair, so we can kind of be suspicious of what they're saying, okay? Okay, so this leads us to our current situation, right? This came to a head historically in the early 20th century. I don't know if you guys remember what Pastor Matt was saying in the sermon today about the fundamentalists, okay? This created a huge controversy because Christians can wholeheartedly acknowledge that we can learn things from the book of nature, right? The physical world. And in fact, this is how the scientific method started, is our belief that God made the world intelligibly and we as image bearers of God can understand what he's saying in the world. So we believe that. But we also believe that there are truth claims in Scripture that also we need to believe, that we have good evidence for, that we can reasonably put our trust in. And now with this new worldview of scientific materialism, this book of nature is now putting on this face of this new worldview, and it's coming into conflict with our view of what Scripture tells us, right? And so historically, Christians kind of fell into two major groups. You had one group that sided universally with special revelation, and they were called the fundamentalists. They remained theologically orthodox, but intellectually isolationists, right? They left the academies. They left the universities. They moved away from the public square, and they became very wary of intellectual movements and intellectual arguments, anti-intellectual, because it had been tainted with this other worldview. And then you had another group, we could call them the mainline denominations in Christianity. They became less and less orthodox over time because they held on to this book of nature, and maybe they realized it, maybe they didn't realize it, but they were also accepting these philosophical presuppositions, right? And so they stayed current with science, but they became less and less orthodox over time due to a greater and greater desire to fit in, to the point where they were denying the deity or even existence of Christ, the resurrection, the gospel, even theism, right? Now, it's a little more complicated. There actually were other groups. There was a third group we could call evangelicals. They were sort of in the middle throughout the period, and a lot of us have roots in that tradition as well. But Orthodox Christians have always struggled with this question, especially in the United States, because of this history. Many of us, I know I do, have fundamentalists in my upbringing who have a lot of influence of these good Christians holding on to the Word of God, but very wary of any intellectual pursuit, right? And so this is how we get this idea of the science and faith dichotomy, that these are things that are at war, because this philosophical movement is at war with our philosophy that we get from the Bible. Does that make sense? Am I making sense to people? You see how that can create this conflict? Okay, so last thing. How do we apply our principles of good thinking with our definitions of science and faith to this debate? I think in general there are really only 4 ways that two areas of knowledge can interact with each other. We have compartmentalization, complementarity, conflict, and coordination, right? So what do I mean by these? So compartmentalization is simply two claims with completely different scopes and they don't interact at all, right? So maybe the first question we ask at all is, can a scientific and biblical claim even overlap, right? So think about the statement, the earth is not the center of the universe, and the earth is the center of God's attention. There's really no overlap there. There can't be conflict because they're not even talking about the same thing, right? Their scopes are completely different. Remember that scope we talked about earlier? Yeah. These things come back up, I promise you. Some people, so this is true of a lot of scientific and biblical statements. However, some people have claimed that this is true of all scientific and biblical statements, that science and faith inhabit a so-called non-overlapping magisteria, noma. Maybe you've heard of this, right? This is the idea that science and faith cannot interact at all because their scopes are completely different, right? But we have to be honest and say this is certainly false. How can we say this? Because neither science nor faith will submit to the NOMA standard, right? Faith makes statements that are historical. And as soon as something makes a historical statement, publicly accessible historical research has the possibility to conflict. And you notice that if a scientist is making the NOMA claim, they're actually pronouncing what the scope of faith is. You see how that works? So non-overlapping magisteria assumes that science can say faith has nothing to say about anything, thus breaking the NOMA rule, right? Because now science is talking about what faith is. Okay, so there can't be complete compartmentalization of everything, okay? But sometimes statements of a science and a historical statement of the Bible or other things can be compartmentalized. They don't really overlap, so we don't have to worry about them. Another one is complementarity, which is basically that two claims about separate parts of the same thing create a filled out picture. So this is true of a lot of things like chemistry and faith, right? These chemical sciences are generally concerned with the regularities of nature, and there's no reason to see how they could be in conflict with faith, right? They're just talking about how the world works. But in case you're thinking that maybe this is an area of compartmentalization, you actually have to see that faith actually provides another layer to this science, right? Faith provides good reasons for understanding why we should expect there to be regularities at all, right? Such as the goodness of God, that he made the world according to his logos, and that we're made in the image of God and cannot understand his logic. So you can see that faith in this idea actually provides why questions that science cannot provide, and the how questions that maybe chemistry is giving us, and the why answers that faith is giving us gives us actually a better holistic view of what the world really is, right? That it has these regularities and they work this way, and this regularities make sense with what we understand from faith. Does that make sense, how they can complement each other? Okay. The third is obviously conflict, okay? If you have two competing claims about the exact same thing, then conflict is possible, right? The obvious example, let's take some examples. The universe had a beginning. The universe had no beginning. Those conflict, okay? There's no way we can really look at the compartmentalization and say, well, do they really overlap? It's like, yes, they're obviously talking about the exact same thing. Are they complementing each other? Isn't it in a sense the universe had no beginning when you really... No, it's like, no. They either didn't or didn't, right? They're conflicting, okay? So, another example could be humans are descended from the same ancestors, or different human populations emerged from separate ancestors. They can't be the same thing. The idea of polygenesis, that different people groups across the world came from different human ancestors and were not actually all related to each other, is in conflict with the idea that we all are related to each other. Does that make sense? See how those conflict with each other? And when you have a conflict, this is the time when we're compelled to either reject one claim or the other. Okay? And so how do we decide how we reject one claim or the other? Our tools of good thinking that we already talked about. We looked at the information that they have. Is their logic sound? Are their premises good? How confident am I in their thing? And are they using the correct scope? These tools help us evaluate claims and determine which one is worth accepting and which one is worth rejecting. Right? Conflict. And last, we have coordination. So coordination is when you have a claim about the same thing where an apparent conflict leads to better interpretation and harmony. Right? So you have two statements. So this is often something that happens in stuff like archaeology and biblical history. Right? Time after time, there's a prevailing archaeological view that precludes a biblical statement of history when, like, for instance, like the Jewish presence in Egypt. However, further research leads to newfound evidence that now reveals that there's better evidence that there was a Jewish presence in Egypt, and therefore now we have a harmony between the two truth claims with now a more filled out picture, right? And it has worked both ways too, right? So as an example, the kingly lists, kingly reigns in Kings and Chronicles conflicted initially with our known information about these reigns from history, until further study revealed that these lists actually were they're counting at the start of the co-regency periods, not the sole rule periods, right? And so if we better understand the way that ancient peoples wrote down these lists of kings, we can see that, now we have a better interpretation of the Bible. Now this is in perfect harmony with what we see in these different sciences. And so this is something that's happening all the time, where science and a biblical interpretation, they initially conflict, but better interpretation leads to a harmony, right? So, whenever you see a claim about science and faith, the first thing you should be asking is, how are they interacting? Is this an issue of compartmentalization? Is this an issue of complementarity, conflict, coordination? And depending on what category it is, this allows us to use different philosophical tools to determine how we explicate these different issues. Okay, let me finish up. Questions to ask. Whenever somebody is talking about science and faith, all right, like me, science and faith, whenever somebody's saying anything about it, you have to ask these questions. 1, what is their definition of science? 2, what is their definition of faith? 3, what do they think the relationship of science or faith is to knowledge? Right? Is faith just the rejection of evidence? And science is the adding of evidence? Well, there's definitely going to be a conflict there, right? 4, what does he think the operating relationship between science and faith is? How do they interact? And finally, what are their model of God's relationship to the world? These are questions that we need to be asking as we talk about these science and faith questions to help us exercise our little gray cells and get ready to answer sometimes really complex questions, really difficult questions, but we have the tools to often smooth out the largest conflicts, right? So those apparent conflicts that I was talking about, those worldview conflicts of scientism, materialism, reductionism, these are in conflict, direct conflict with Christianity, but with clear thinking we can mitigate these different issues and realize that really science as science is practiced with our definition has no conflict with faith. And if it does, usually it's very superficial, right? And clear thinking can help us clear that up. Okay. Let me finish up. So let's practice. Does anybody have any questions? That is it. I am done. You suffered through it. I know there was a lot of philosophy. We were just talking about ideas. You're like, Luke, you didn't even talk about evolution. I mean, I talked about it a little bit. But I think, honestly, what we all need, more than ideas about a specific conflict that you have in mind, is how to think about it. Okay, and I hope that I gave you something there. But let's talk about it. You guys can ask me any questions about the talk, but I also welcome any questions about conflicts that you've heard between science and faith. I want to talk about it. I want you guys to ask me any questions you have.
And if you guys would, I'm going to have a second microphone here, and I'll pass this to you.
And feel free to leave. It has been an hour. I don't want you to leave, but you can leave. We didn't really have lunch. I mean, it was food, but it wasn't really lunch. Okay, so again, don't feel. I'm here. I will answer any and all questions, and I will stand here until everybody leaves. So be kind to me. Yes?
Well, those slides will be on the webpage?
I actually don't know the answer to that question, whether the slides will be on the webpage, but they could be.
Josh, did you capture the slides in the video?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this video will get posted to the church's YouTube channel, if that's okay with you, Luke.
Of course.
And then anyone can watch it at any time.
I was made for the camera. So yes, they should be able to see any and all of the slides and the discussion on the YouTube page, or audio, but yeah. Any questions? Yeah.
So,
Thank you, Luke. That was just outstanding, so insightful and so clear. I wonder, when you were talking about the definitions of science, it seems like one of the aspects of that was it's empirical.
Yeah.
Could you comment a little bit on how that is, that understanding is beginning to accommodate, or how people are thinking about these more recent realities among scientists whereby so much of it has to do with simply mathematical models. You know, when someone like Heisenberg would talk about, hey, look, I'd like to be a positivist in the sense of only the stuff that we can see, but
Yeah.
you know, we've just really got mathematical models here to deal with this. And shall we not say that this is part of reality because it just makes sense mathematically? Is it? How is that accommodated? Do we need to adapt the definition a little bit to accommodate that, or can you fit it in? Help us.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. So the question is, how do we deal with mathematical models and things that aren't, strictly speaking, observations as much as they are sort of the extension of math that we know now and we can extend out. And I think I would be careful with. I want to make sure that it's clear that when I say empiricism, I'm being very broad with that term. I'm saying want to encompass all basically publicly accessible information about the world. And that would include the mathematical world. And one of the things I wanted to talk about, but I definitely couldn't given the time, was models and paradigms and how that functions in science. But yes, we should be very clear that observations about the physical world, the greater world, includes things like math. And really, math is very complementary to the Christian worldview, right? That there is an actual logic to the universe. Does it? Yeah, I understand that's a very good qualifier. I appreciate that. Any other questions? Lay it on me.
Hey, I thought that was a really good presentation.
Oh,
I really like the approach of like coming up with a rational idea towards what we see in the world and what we read in the Bible.
Yeah.
But there are definitely instances in the Bible which are like a conflict to everything that we've seen in the world. And for instance, I think the most salient one is, say, the resurrection of Christ. That, like, we all know people don't raise from the dead. That's not a thing, but it's the most core thing to faith, to the resurrection and to forgiveness of sins. And so I guess my question, and this is particularly when talking to non-Christians, what is it that where's the line in the sand for when we have to kind of return from this kind of logical approach towards saying this is something that is contrary to everything we'd ever see in the natural world. Because I think a lot of the issues that science, quote unquote science, and faith have are a lot of times just interpretations that the church has propagated and kind of broadly given as an acceptance. But there are definitely instances where, like I said, given like, for instance, like the resurrection, where it's just not true, as far as you can't resurrect someone from the dead without the supernatural intervention of God.
True. No, I totally agree with you. I think that's an important point to bring up, that I don't think that we can get everything that we need to have a robust Christian worldview from just looking at nature, right? And I think there is, I want to point out, there is actually a philosophical assumption, a philosophical premise that somebody would be bringing in if they want to say, I can't believe in Christianity because I don't think people come back from the dead. What's the philosophical presupposition? The premise is the natural world is all there is. So the things that we learn from the natural world are the only things that are true, right? So think about this. So if I'm going to look at the evidence for the resurrection, right? We look at the eyewitness accounts. We look at the fact that they're written by different people, that they have uncommon ways of overlapping with each other. They have fits with external biblical evidence that there was the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. So historically, we have a lot of evidence, right? But the reason why somebody would say, out of hand, I cannot believe that, before even looking at the evidence, is a philosophical assertion, which says, miracles are impossible, right? And so that is the place where there's going to be a conflict, not the actual looking at the evidence part, right? Because Christians, we believe, like I believe in the resurrection, not because I was raised to believe it, but because I am very confident in the information that I get from the eyewitness testimony in the scriptures, and that the only possible explanation for the event, the historical event, using my abductive inferences, the only possible explanation for these events is what the apostles said, right, in their eyewitness testimony. So it is impossible to use natural means to prove a supernatural thing. Does that make sense? Because it's like our meter doesn't go that far, right? And so if you start off by saying, well, I'm only going to look at those things that are scientifically verifiable and make sense with the regularities that I see in nature, then you're automatically going to preclude all of the Christian worldview. Any theistic worldview, right? But that's materialism, that's not science, right? That's what most scientists, I would say, are materialists. Well, maybe I shouldn't say most. The car analogy, right? Many scientists are materialists. And so you have to deal with materialism as an idea before you deal with, let's look at the evidence. Because if I talk to a materialist and say, I have evidence that somebody rose from the dead, they're going to say, ha, people don't rise from the dead. That's impossible. Therefore, there is no actual objective looking at the. Does that make sense? Is that fair? No, yeah. But this is an example, I should say, sorry. This is an example of how our philosophical assumptions can stop us from actually applying distantiation, right? That good form of bias where we remove ourselves emotionally from the question and say, what does the evidence say, right? Okay. Lay it on me.
So I really appreciate the distinction between scientific reasoning and faith-based reasoning.
Yeah.
But when you say that faith is a rational trust,
Yes.
and you explained about how scientific reasoning is based on inductive or deductive methods.
Or abductive.
Yeah. But in the scripture, we know how it still says faith is believing things that are unseen. So in that case, could faith have any more clear distinction to scientific reasoning?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that when the Bible says that faith is about things unseen, it's talking about the fact that most or all of us were not eyewitnesses to the events of the Bible, right? And so for all of us, they are unseen. And we're talking about a supernatural being who does not have a body, who is a spirit that we cannot see with our eyes, right? And so, so when I think it's talking about our trust in the evidence we have for the unseen, right? I think that's what it means when it's talking about our assurance of things that aren't seen, right? And I think the words of Jesus are helpful here. So if we look at what he told Thomas, right, doubting Thomas, the first scientist, when he was resurrected, right? And the apostles, there were apostles, there were people, believers, who had seen Jesus alive and resurrected in a body. And they told Thomas. And the evidence of the eyewitnesses was not enough for Thomas. He said, BS. I will believe that only if I can stick my finger in his wound, right? And so when Jesus appears to Thomas, he says, okay, Thomas, here's the wound. Stick it in there, right? And he's like, oh, and he's like, go, do it. You said you wouldn't believe unless you do it. And then he does it, and Jesus said, blessed are those who believe without seeing, right? And what he's saying is, blessed are those who believe in what they have been told by reliable eyewitnesses, right? And so we have to be careful not to over-reasonalize, I made that word up, make over-rational our faith in the sense that, I need to have scientific proof of X, Y, and Z, or I need to look at every single little thing. I think at the end of the day, it's the rational trust of a person that differentiates our faith from the scientific way of thinking, right? It's the same way that we interact in all of our lives, right? I have faith in my wife that she is taking care of my kids right now who are sick without the house burning down, right? Do I have direct evidence that that's happening right now? No, but I have enough evidence of my interactions with my wife to know that when I leave, I can trust her with her responsibilities, right? And so this is the same with faith. Our faith isn't evidence all the way up, proof all the way up to the end. There is an inference that we have to make. But what I'm saying, what I want to emphasize is that the inference is a reasonable inference, right? It's not merely something that you can only believe if you just reject all knowledge. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions? Lay it on me, Ralph.
So when you listed out 4 possible interactions, it was not your, is it fair to say that it was not your intent to say that only one of these possible interactions is the best way? But what you have are 4 possible and possibly good ways of interacting and modeling your interaction.
100%. 100%. So we remember, with our definitions of science and faith, science isn't just one thing that we cannot pick and choose with, right? So we have to know that in every given situation, a science with a specific sort of claim can fit into one of these 4 categories. And the same is true of faith. There are some claims in the Bible that would be compartmentalized versus others. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes, and the question that I had is,
Yeah.
which one do you find you using yourself in your scientific endeavors?
Yes, so I am 100% looking at regularities in my regular day job. And so because I'm looking at regularities, I'm really solidly in the complementary zone, right? There's nothing that I do that is inconsistent or that brings up conflict. Now, this isn't true of other people in different sciences. I'm sure if you're a geologist or if you're a paleontologist, sociologist, archaeologist, these are the historical sciences, and they will interact more aggressively, or evolutionary biology. These are historical sciences that interact more directly with the historical claims of the Bible. And so that's where a lot of the overlap is going to be. And sometimes the ethical sciences too. If you think about the claims of psychology, whenever a scientist starts saying what a human being is, there's possibility for there being conflict with Christianity, because we make specific claims about what is a human being, right? And so if you make a materialist claim about a human being, we're merely animals, that can lead to serious moral differences, right? Lay it on me.
Yeah,
I love it.
I have another question. This actually goes back to the question of scope. And so this is something that if we look at the Bible, we actually have a good feeling of, because, even Paul says that, we know in part, and that, one day we'll, actually
see through glass darkly. Kind of.
Exactly, yeah. And so the completeness of our data from the Bible, I was wondering if this is kind of an open-ended question, but could you comment on the data set, if you will, that we have through the Bible, and what scope we are able to kind of determine from our data? Even the disciples weren't aware of, Christ's deity until he revealed it to their eyes, right? So I was just wondering if, you could give your personal interpretation of, the scope of the data that we have in the Bible, our actual record.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think it all depends on your view of the appropriate interpretation of many parts of the Bible, right? And so, for instance, a young earth creationist, they will read the first chapters of Genesis as a straight, literal explanation, almost like a journalist, of what's happening and how it's happening, right? And so if you have that view of those early chapters of Genesis, that's going to include a lot of things in the scope of what the Bible is talking about that maybe people who don't share that view will not have that part of the scope, right? And so it is a difficult question. I think for most, I would say definitely the vast majority of the Bible that it's talking about if it's talking about something that's going to be conflicting with science, or that the scope of it would be historical, right? There's a lot of historical scope to the Bible, and we have to accept that, and we have to acknowledge that this is a legitimate way of getting information about these time periods and these peoples, right? But the primary purpose of the Bible is to explicate the identity of Jesus Christ as the Savior of the world, as understood as the Jewish Messiah, right? And how the redemptive history of God unfolds throughout the centuries, throughout time. That includes the scope of God as creator, right? That includes the scope of what it means to be human, right? So there's a lot of different things. Keep on tabbing that thing. I personally don't take a young earth creationist view of the early chapters of Genesis. And so I have a less expansive scope about the how questions that I think the Bible is providing. Does that make sense? And so that is going to restrict some of the things. But I think depending on your level of conviction and your grade of confidence in your interpretation of different passages of the Bible, that's going to determine the scope, right? I want to make sure that we don't get in the habit of trying to compartmentalize everything, right? Because there is a tendency, even among scientifically minded Christians, to say that the Bible is really only about spiritual things. It's really only about our relationship with God, and it doesn't really make any claims about anything other than that, God exists, he loves us, he died for our sins. There really is a lot more included in the scope than that, and we have to be cognizant of that and really take that seriously. Yeah.
I think we have one back here, one at the front, and then Matt.
Yeah, so to expand on that further, could you talk a little bit more about how you think about the historical claims of early Genesis, specifically number one, like the Adam and Eve account, and number two, the flood, and also, the fact that everyone's descended from Noah's, three sons?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a good question. Luckily, there is no controversy over this, so this will be very straightforward to everybody. So no, I take in the early chapters of Genesis what is sometimes called the analogical day view of the early chapters of Genesis, which means that Moses is using the figure of speech, using an analogy to describe God's activity in creation and the making of humanity. Now, this is different than a purely poetic point of view, which says that really this is just telling us about spiritual truths. I think that the Bible is telling us about what happened. It's not telling us how it happened directly. Does that make sense? So I think Adam and Eve were human ancestors that all human beings share, right? They're the first human beings, and I think that they were created by God. And I believe they were created by God sinless, and that they fell into sin, right? These are I wouldn't say touchstone truth. These are very central claims to the Christian worldview, right? Now, when the Bible says that God made Adam and Eve from the dust of the ground, is it using a figure of speech there, or is it being literal? I know that they're using the figure of speech of forming like clay and breathing life into it, right? But is that trying to tell us the how of how how humans were created, right? Or was there a more complicated, more different way of looking at it, right? So I think that would be my view, is that maybe it's a little more complicated than taking it at face value, although the face value is meant to communicate a real historical truth. You mentioned the flood too. There's different views. To be honest with you, I waffle. I waffle quite a bit sometimes. I think when it comes to the flood, initially I was very convinced by a global flood, and by that I mean covering the entire globe. And then I became more convinced of a local flood, what is called a worldwide flood, which means a flood that affected all of humanity, but didn't cover the entire earth all the way around, right? But I don't know. I mean, to be honest with you, I'm open to this. I'm open to be convinced. I think it's clear that the flood did affect the humanity, right? It did affect all of humanity, is the way I would take it. Now, did it cover every mountain peak? I'm not sure, right? But, I mean, there's crazy evidence that there were these giant, huge global floods that didn't cover literally every mountain, but were very widespread over the entire earth at the end of the end of the Ice Age. So, that's getting pretty close to a global flood. But again, when it comes to my gradation of confidence, I don't have enough confidence to say this one or the other. I'm open to being convinced either way. Yeah. But I think that when it comes to the theological claims that are being made in the early chapters of Genesis, its scope in that situation is how humanity was affected, how human civilization was affected by God's judgment. Matt, I knew it. I love your questions.
Oh, great. So I'm thinking of Stephen Meyer.
Yes.
The Return of the God Hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, him thinking it's helpful or important to say, hey, you know what? The best science today gives, no plausible explanation for the origin of life. Just wondering, how helpful you think, controversy like that is.
Yeah, so when it comes to intelligent design, I am a fan of a lot of the specific claims that intelligent design advocates argue for, but you have to be careful, and I'm always very cognizant of this. You have to be careful because there is a logical fallacy called the God of the gaps, okay, that we have to be careful about. So the God of the gaps is a fallacy that says just because we don't know how something happened, therefore God is the only thing that could be a good explanation of that, right? That's the fallacy. So the question I always ask when it comes to an intelligent design claim is the gap that they're identifying, is that a gap due to knowledge? We just don't know how it happened? Or is it a gap in terms of ability? Is it even possible for this to be explainable naturalistically, right? And so, for instance, the origin of life, to me, it seems pretty hard to believe that non-life produces life, right? And it's not just I wonder what the sequence would be, right? I think that there's an impossibility in the nature of physical things, non-living physical things, to produce living things. Does that make sense? And so in that case, I would say, okay, I find that intelligent design argument convincing, right? Same thing with the origin of the universe, of physicality itself. The fact that there was a definitive time in the past where before that time there was no matter, space, or time. And then after that time, there was matter, space, and time. There is nothing in the physical universe that can cause itself to happen. Does that make sense? Before the universe began, there was nothing physical. I don't think people really understand this. When we're saying that there was nothing, we're not saying that there was a big vacuum. There wasn't even space. There wasn't even physical space. So there was nothing, literally nothing, to cause the something that we have later, right? And so logically, I think it's an impossibility to explain something emerging from nothing in a naturalistic way. Does that make sense? Now, in principle, I don't have any issue with God exercising his vast power creationally in a providential way, using natural mechanisms to have things happen, like the winds blowing on the Red Sea, right? The seas didn't just part, like the molecules of the sea didn't just part. God sent a wind, and the wind did the parting part, right? So there's a space for God to work providentially through natural mechanisms. I think when we're looking at the evidence, applying our good thinking, are there any fallacies on the different parts? And for intelligent design, I think we always have to be careful about the God to the gaps. And so just being careful of that. I think sometimes we just ignore, we just think that that's a hand-wavy answer, but it really is a serious problem. Any other questions? We've only gotten a few controversial ones. I was expecting more. Yeah.
Luke, that was really helpful on the last question. Could you integrate that a little bit with the common notion that we all use, particularly scientists, inference to the best possible explanation?
Yes.
And maybe what the best possible explanation is a very subjective thing, depending upon what sort of accessible realities are within each person's philosophy.
Exactly. So yeah. So what the inference to the best explanation is abductive inferences that we talked about, historical inferences, where we look at an event and we say, what possible explanations could explain this, and which one of those is most likely? Now, what John is pointing out is that some people exclude possible explanations from being in the running to explain a certain event. So for instance, like I was mentioning the beginning of the universe. If you start off by saying, well, there's nothing but the universe, nothing but physicality, and so the fact that there wasn't anything before the start of the universe physically, and it somehow just happened, you're left with like a puzzle. But because you are limiting yourself, you're removing the possibility that there is a supernatural explanation for the beginning of the universe that is beyond the physical world, then you're just kind of stuck with well, I don't really know. Maybe it was, quantum universe generation in a vacuum of blah, 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 right? And that makes more sense to you and is more plausible than God because you have excluded God as a possible explanation. Does that make sense? It makes a lot more sense if you say a rational agent of immense power brought the world into existence than these theoretical quantum machines that, again, I have doubts have any real validity to them. But anyways, yeah. So we have to be careful. Remember the bad bias, excluding things that shouldn't be excluded, that's what's going to come in.
Can I ask one more
Yeah,
question?
go for
Sorry,
it, man.
I don't mean to keep...
I love questions.
So in scientific pursuits, I think one of the foundational ways to advance scientific knowledge and one of the foundational pieces of a scientific endeavor is to come up with an idea of how a system works, and then from that model, form a testable hypothesis to confirm or deny whether that model makes sense.
Yeah.
So do you think that we should be applying kind of like the same ideas or strategies to our theological understanding? For instance, if we have a theological idea of how something is, form like a testable almost hypothesis on whether we can confirm or deny our understanding.
Yeah, so I think in a broad way, I would say that might be helpful. So again, I want to be careful to say that, oftentimes when we're talking about creating a model that we would have a hypothesis that we can test, when we're thinking of the term test, we're thinking experiment, right? And obviously many things in the Bible are not testable by experiment, right? But in a broad sense, I think it's a good idea to say, okay, I have this based on my reading of the Bible, based on my philosophical understanding and my theological training, I have this conception of God, of the universe. Now let me take this idea for a spin, right? And I think that's what you mean where we can apply this idea of creating a hypothesis and testing it. Well, let's take our ideas out for a spin. What are the consequences of this idea in all these different areas of life? And see, does that make sense, the most sense out of the things that I'm observing in the world, right? I think that's a very good idea. And I think if we don't do that, then we get into a lot of trouble. So yes, I think in our theological pursuit, in our scientific pursuits, we should find ways to take our ideas out for a spin and see whether we crash into any trees. Metaphorically speaking. Yes?
I have a question. This has been great, by the way.
Thank you.
I'm looking a little bit to go back to the topic of eyewitness testimony, and because that's so important for our faith. It's mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15 as evidence for the resurrection and so forth. So just on the spectrum of things, would you consider firsthand eyewitness testimony, is that a nascent form of science? Or to look at it from the other way, is science just an expansion of eyewitness testimony, sort of? So if I were to be talking to a scientist, could I say, could I say science is really just a formalization, an expansion, a systematization.
I gotcha.
Good. Form of eyewitness testimony.
I mean, I think that's an interesting idea. I have never considered it, but I think there's a lot of truth to it. I think there's one of the primary things that helps us think about is the fact that science doesn't happen in a vacuum. Science is always performed by a human being, right? Or it's maybe performed by a computer that a human being has made, right? And so at any stage, there's a point at which the human being has to come into contact with whatever it's measuring, whatever they're measuring, and make a determination based on that, right? So for me, if I'm staining cells for a specific marker, I put it under a microscope. The microscope takes a picture at a certain wavelength of light. I then get a picture spit out. I make sure that all the levels are correct, and then I look at the picture. And then I have to make the determination, what am I seeing, right? And so even if it's just a number coming out, the interpretation part is much like eyewitness testimony in the sense that there has to be an observer for the observation to exist. Does that make sense? So if a lab falls over in the forest and there's no one around, no observations are made, right? No science occurs, right? So science is a very human endeavor that involves human beings making judgments, oftentimes using our eyes. And so, yeah, can we describe eyewitness, the activity of being an eyewitness in a broader way to include just observations or just our interpretations of what we see? Yeah, I think it's helpful. And eyewitness testimony is a data point in historical sciences as well. Sorry, go ahead, John.
You might want to concede that, in principle, science should be replicable. Right.
Yes.
So even though in function, you take all kinds of stuff on authority, say 99% of what you're doing to get to where you are runs on authority. It's just related from authoritative things. In principle, at least, in science, you ought to be able to go back. Where in eyewitness testimony, that's not always the possibility that you could go back out of your courtroom and say, oh, well, let's go back and observe what actually did happen in this crime scene.
Exactly. I think
there's a potentially significant distinction.
That is true, and I think it's important, especially when we're talking about regularities in science. When you're talking about a historical event that it's being studied, it is helpful to maybe the event isn't replicatable, but the analysis should be replicatable, right? So I think that's where the replication comes in when we're talking about historical stuff. For a scientist studying regularities, in principle, the same cells in the same environment in a different place across the world should in principle behave the same, and so we can replicate what happened. When it's a historical situation, assuming everybody has the same access to the same amount of information, and they're applying the same rules of good, clear thinking, should come up with the same conclusion, I think maybe it's sort of getting at that replication part. But yeah, it's tough. It's tough because the historical sciences behave so much differently than the regularities.
That strikes me as important. That when we're in the realm of so much that is pertaining to Christianity, we're looking at historical claims, right?
Yes.
Which they function very differently
Yes.
than the claims of what we now call the natural sciences.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So,
Or the hard sciences. Right.
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yep. So, and I think sometimes, I thought you did a really good job earlier in the talk of saying how in our cultural moment, science carries so much, and what we mean by that is usually the hard sciences,
Right.
natural sciences, carries so much authority, right? And then that can sort of break down what we think of as just good rational thinking. It's sort of, if an academic discipline doesn't bow to the methods of the hard sciences, it's a lesser than science,
Exactly.
right? And I think
Exactly.
you've done a good job in your talk trying to push against that.
Yeah, and
See
it's,
that different sciences need to work differently, and that's good.
exactly. And I think it's unfair to all those geologists out there because they always get pushed off into the social sciences. They're like, well, I don't know. I haven't seen your experiments. You are not a and it's an important point. Science is a power word, and there's a vested interest among some scientists and institutions to exclude some areas of rational study using the principles of publicly accessible data systematically and critically, those things that we could call us science, they have a vested interest in excluding those things so that they don't get the white coat of authority to say, yes, now you're able to say things that I had to take seriously on authority.
Well, and I appreciate you challenging us to clear thinking because
Yeah.
there are very popular introductions to the New Testament, for example, written by faculty members who will start out by saying, well, the claim of the resurrection isn't a historical claim because it's not something that happens over and over again in history. Well, that's the point. So you can see how there's a little bit of a shell game happening there, or a sloppy thinking. That sounds really plausible, though, at first for us,
Right.
as humans in the modern age, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, like history, things should be repeatable, right? But then we're applying that to a different area,
Exactly.
and suddenly we're falling into all sorts of fallacies of thinking. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
I'll tell you whose New Testament introduction that is after that.
Okay, yeah. No, yeah, and it becomes immediately insane as soon as you start applying those same principles to your everyday life. You know, like I need to have a double-blind study with my wife in different situations where she doesn't know that I'm testing her, and I'm looking at us for a specific thing, and then suddenly I'll have trust in her to be able to do this thing, right? Because now I have verifiable information. It's like, no, that's insane. That's a good way to sleep on the couch. So.
You were thinking about 30 seconds?
Yes.
Just good books that you could recommend
Yes.
that help for these topics that you've raised.
So if you look at the very last, maybe we'll call this the last question, because you guys have been very patient. But the further reading at the back of the outline, if you don't have it, you have outline, yeah. There are outlines in the back. I think just to say it in case you don't have one, I think for the history of science, Tom Holland's Dominion is really great. He's not a Christian, but he acknowledges the influence that Christianity had on science in its development. Science and Faith, Friend or Foes by C. John Collins. If you read the first few chapters of that book, you're going to be embarrassed by how much I stole from it. Science and Secularism by J.P. Moreland really gets at the problem of scientism. Can Science Explain Everything? John C. Lennox is great. And then, obviously, Where the Conflict Really Lies by Alvin Plantinga, a famous disputation on the problems of naturalism in science and how Christianity is a better explanation for the scientific endeavor than naturalism. Okay, guys. Thanks so much. Good question.